The riverside storage facility sat like a graveyard of forgotten dreams, its rows of metal units baking under the California sun. Sarah Martinez clutched her auction paddle with sweating hands, knowing she had exactly $200 left to her name, and 2 kids depending on her to find something, anything they could sell. Unit 47 was the one nobody wanted. Too big, too expensive, too much of a gamble for the other bidders who'd walked away shaking their heads. What Sarah didn't know was that 15 years ago, she'd been one of the FBI's most promising forensic accountants, the woman who could trace money through the darkest corners of organized crime. She'd buried that life when her husband died, trading her badge for bedtime stories, but inside Unit 47, behind that rusted door, wasn't just a tiny house. It was a perfect replica of the safe house where she'd once hidden a witness who knew too much about a billion-dollar conspiracy, the same witness who'd supposedly died in protective custody. Who had built this shrine to her past, and how did they know exactly where to find her? The auctioneer's voice cut through the desert heat like a rusty blade. Going once for $150, going twice. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. $150 would leave her with $50 and whatever treasures or trash lay behind that corrugated steel door. $175, she called out, her voice cracking. The crowd turned to stare at the woman in faded jeans and a Target clearance blouse. She caught their expressions, part pity, part judgment, the desperate single mom making a fool's bet. If only they knew she'd once commanded rooms full of federal agents, had testified before Congress, had made grown men in $1,000 suits break down and confess their crimes. But that woman was gone, buried alongside David in that rain-soaked cemetery 3 years ago. Sold to bidder 23. The auctioneer's gavel echoed like a gunshot. Sarah's knees nearly buckled as she approached the payment table, counting out crumpled 20s and 10s. The facility manager, a sun-weathered man named Chuck, handed her a key that felt heavier than it should. "You sure about this one, hon? Been sitting here for 6 months. Previous owner stopped paying rent, never came back for his stuff. Could be anything in there, or nothing." Sarah nodded, though certainty was a luxury she couldn't afford. As the other bidders dispersed, to their wins, she walked the length of the facility toward Unit 47. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the rows, making the place feel abandoned despite the activity. Unit 47 sat at the very end of the facility, isolated from the others by a maintenance area overgrown with weeds. The metal door was streaked with rust and dust, but something about it seemed different, wrong. The lock was new, too new for a unit that had supposedly been abandoned months ago. Sarah inserted the key with trembling fingers. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, and she grabbed the door's handle. It rolled up with barely a sound, as if the mechanisms had been recently oiled. What she saw inside made her step backward so quickly she nearly tripped over her own feet. It wasn't a storage unit crammed with boxes and furniture. It was a tiny house, but not just any tiny house. Her breath caught as her eyes registered details that shouldn't exist, memories that should have stayed buried. The pale blue curtains with tiny yellow flowers, the small kitchen table with the cigarette burn near the corner, the brown leather recliner positioned precisely 3 feet from a 32-inch television. "This isn't possible," she whispered, but her feet carried her forward anyway. Every detail was perfect, down to the positioning of the mismatched throw pillows on the couch. It was the Riverside safe house from 2009, the place where she'd spent 3 months protecting Maria Santos, the accountant who'd agreed to testify against the Delgado crime family. The same Maria Santos who died in a car accident 2 weeks before the trial, taking with her the only evidence that could have brought down a billion-dollar money laundering operation. Sarah's hand found the doorframe as her legs threatened to give out. Someone had recreated the safe house down to the last detail. But who and how? The FBI had destroyed that place after Maria's death, had classified every detail of its layout and contents. A soft beeping sound made her freeze. It was coming from inside the tiny house, rhythmic and electronic, like a security system, like someone monitoring the space, like someone still lived here. Sarah backed toward the entrance, her mind racing through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. 15 years she'd been Sarah Martinez's widow and mother, but standing in the doorway of her past, she felt the sharp edges of Agent Martinez scratching at her carefully constructed new identity. Someone knew exactly who she was. Someone knew exactly where to find her, and they'd been waiting. The fluorescent lights of the storage facility hummed overhead as Sarah stood frozen in the doorway of Unit 47, her heart hammering against her ribs. The tiny house before her looked impossibly real, impossibly lived in. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, casting a stronger beam across the cramped space. Every detail screamed recent habitation. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the miniature kitchen counter, the liquid inside still bearing a thin film that couldn't be more than a day old. A paperback novel lay open on the built-in bench, its pages bent as if someone had been interrupted mid-sentence. The air carried the faint scent of vanilla and something else, something that made her skin crawl. Fear. Sarah forced herself to step inside, her footsteps echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The tiny house was a masterpiece of efficiency, with every inch maximized. A Murphy bed folded down from one wall, unmade sheets tangled as if someone had left in a hurry. Above it, a small window had been painted black from the inside, blocking any view from the outside world. She moved toward the kitchenette, noting the still plugged-in mini refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. How was there electricity in here? Storage units didn't come with power. Her hand trembling, she opened the refrigerator door. Milk that wouldn't expire for another week. Fresh fruit. A takeout container from Chen's Palace with yesterday's date stamped on the receipt taped to the top. This wasn't just evidence of recent habitation. Someone had been living here yesterday. Maybe this morning. A soft thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the storage facility, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. She clicked off her flashlight, plunging herself into darkness, and strained to listen. Footsteps. Definitely footsteps, growing closer. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized her position. She was trapped inside a storage unit with only one exit, and someone was coming. The footsteps paused outside Unit 47. Sarah pressed herself against the tiny house's bathroom door, trying to make herself invisible in the darkness. The storage unit's metal door began to rise with a grinding screech. Sarah held her breath, her pulse so loud she was certain whoever was out there could hear it. A beam of light swept across the storage unit, and she caught a glimpse of work boots beneath the door of the tiny house. Mail, probably. The light moved systematically, checking corners. "I know someone's been in here," a voice muttered. Low, gravelly, with an edge of desperation that made Sarah's skin crawl. The lock was different. "Always check your six, always check your locks." The voice was talking to itself, rambling with the cadence of someone who'd spent too much time alone. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and prayed the tiny house's windows were too dark for the light to penetrate effectively. The footsteps moved around the unit's perimeter, and Sarah realized with growing horror that he was checking everything. Her car was parked outside. Her purse was sitting on the ground where she'd dropped it when she first saw the tiny house. "Well, well," the voice said, and she could hear him picking up her purse. Sarah Martinez. He was reading her driver's license, local address. How interesting. Sarah's mind raced. He had her license, her address. He knew where she lived, where Emma went to school. This had escalated beyond a simple break-in or trespassing. This was something much worse. The footsteps approached the tiny house directly now, and Sarah realized she had seconds before he discovered her. Her hand fell to the bathroom door handle behind her, and she turned it slowly, praying it wouldn't creak. The door opened into a space barely large enough for a person to stand, but it was something. Light flooded the tiny house's main area as the front door opened. "Somebody's been sleeping in my bed," the voice said, and Sarah could hear the sick smile in his words. "Somebody's been eating my food. And somebody," the footsteps moved closer, "is still here." Sarah eased the bathroom door closed behind her and found herself in complete darkness. Her hands explored the tiny space frantically, searching for anything that might help. Her fingers found something unexpected, another door handle, a back exit she hadn't noticed before. She turned it carefully and felt cool air rush in. The tiny house had been positioned to allow access to the back of the storage unit, where a section of the facility's outer wall had been cut away. An escape route. The main door of the tiny house creaked as he stepped fully inside. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pushed through the hidden exit and found herself in the alley behind the storage facility. Her car keys were in her purse, which he now had, along with her identification. But her phone was in her pocket. As she ran toward the street, she could hear him discovering her escape route, his voice rising in anger behind her. Whatever this was, wherever this led, there was no going back now. She had stumbled into someone's carefully constructed hideaway, and that someone knew exactly who she was. The locksmith's drill bit snapped against the reinforced deadbolt for the third time. Sarah watched him wipe sweat from his forehead as he reached for another tool, muttering something about military-grade hardware that had no business being on a storage unit door. "You sure you own this thing?" he asked, eyeing the complex locking mechanism that looked more suited to a bank vault than a 10 by 20 storage space. Sarah showed him the auction paperwork again, her pulse quickening. Whatever was behind that door, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it secure. The other bidders at yesterday's auction had steered clear of Unit 247 entirely, whispering about bad luck and unpaid bills stretching back 3 years. But Sarah had seen opportunity where others saw risk. The lock finally gave way with a metallic shriek that echoed through the storage facility. Sarah pushed the heavy door up, and fluorescent light spilled into the space, revealing something that made her breath catch in her throat. A complete tiny house sat inside the unit, so perfectly constructed and positioned that it seemed impossible it had been built anywhere else. Cedar siding gleamed under the harsh lights, and miniature windows reflected her shocked expression back at her. A compact front door, painted sage green, faced the entrance as if welcoming visitors to an elaborate dollhouse, scaled up to human proportions. "Well, I'll be damned," the locksmith whispered. "Never seen anything like that before." Sarah stepped closer, running her fingers along the smooth wood siding. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every joint seamless, every detail carefully considered. Solar panels topped the slanted roof, and she could see the outline of what appeared to be a small air conditioning unit tucked discreetly along one side. But it was the subtle signs of habitation that made her skin crawl. A garden hose connected to a spigot she hadn't noticed near the back wall, an extension cord snaking from an electrical outlet to somewhere underneath the structure. Most unsettling of all, the faint but unmistakable scent of coffee drifting from the tiny house's vicinity. The locksmith gathered his tools, clearly eager to leave. "You want some advice? Whatever you paid for this, it wasn't enough. Good luck with whatever this is." Sarah barely heard him go. She circled the tiny house slowly, noting details that sent chills down her spine. The windows had curtains, drawn tight but expensive-looking. A small deck extended from the front door, complete with a miniature outdoor chair and what looked like a carefully tended succulent garden in window boxes. Someone was living here, or had been very recently. She tried the front door handle and found it locked, but this was a simple residential deadbolt that yielded to the lock-picking skills she'd acquired during her more rebellious teenage years. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Sarah stepped into a space that defied every assumption she'd made about storage unit living. The interior was a masterpiece of efficient design. A Murphy bed folded into the wall, revealing a small living area with built-in seating and storage. A compact kitchen featured a 2-burner induction cooktop, a small refrigerator humming quietly, and cabinets stocked with canned goods and coffee supplies. Everything was meticulously organized and spotlessly clean. But it was the walls that made Sarah's blood run cold. Every available surface was covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps connected by red string in patterns that spoke of obsession. At the center of it all was a photograph of a woman Sarah recognized with a jolt of recognition that nearly knocked her backward. Detective Lisa Chen. Sarah's former college roommate, the one person who'd stayed in touch through the years, who'd called just 2 weeks ago to catch up over coffee. The photograph was surrounded by dozens of others showing Lisa leaving her apartment, walking her dog, entering the police station where she worked. Surveillance photos, taken with a telephoto lens by someone who'd been watching her for weeks, maybe months. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the newspaper clippings. Stories about cases Lisa had worked on, departmental promotions, even a small item from the local paper about Lisa winning a community service award. Someone had been tracking every detail of her friend's life with the methodical precision of a predator. A soft sound from outside the tiny house made Sarah freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, moving closer to the storage unit. She peered through a gap in the curtains and saw a figure approaching in the dim light of the facility's security lamps. Tall, wearing dark clothing, moving with the purposeful gait of someone returning home. Sarah's phone was in her car, too far away to reach without being seen. The tiny house suddenly felt like a trap, its cozy interior transformed into a confined space with only one exit. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, heart hammering as the footsteps grew closer, knowing that whoever had built this elaborate hiding place was coming back. And they probably weren't expecting company. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph, studying every detail in the harsh fluorescent light of the storage facility. The woman in the picture bore an unmistakable resemblance to herself. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, even the same way of holding her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. But it was the handwriting on the back that made her blood run cold. Elena Martinez, age 28, before the disappearance. Martinez. Her surname, her father's surname. She sank onto the tiny house's fold-out step, her mind racing. Her father had never mentioned having a sister, but then again he'd never talked much about his family at all. Every time she'd asked about relatives, he'd grown quiet and changed the subject. Her mother had always said it was too painful for him, that some families were better left in the past. The wind picked up outside the storage unit, rattling the metal door and sending a chill through the space. Sarah looked around the tiny house again, seeing it with fresh eyes. The meticulous organization, the way everything had its place. It reminded her of her father's workshop, where every tool hung in perfect alignment. She opened the notebook again, flipping through pages of careful observations. Most entries were mundane: weather patterns, delivery schedules for the storage facility, notes about which units had activity. But scattered throughout were more personal entries, written in a shakier hand. Day 847, still no word from Roberto. Does he think I'm dead like everyone else? Roberto. Her father's name. Day 891, saw in the paper that he married. She looks kind. Maybe it's better this way. Day 1203, he has a daughter now. Sarah Elena Martinez. She has Papa's eyes. Sarah Elena. She'd never known her middle name came from someone specific. Her throat tightened as she continued reading. Day 1556. She's walking now. Roberto doesn't know I sometimes watch from the parking lot at the grocery store. I stay far enough away. It's safer for everyone. The entries jumped forward in time, tracking years of Sarah's life from a distance. First days of school, soccer games, graduation. Someone had been watching her grow up. Someone who shared her name and apparently her blood. A sound from outside made Sarah freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. She held her breath, listening as they approached the storage unit. The footsteps paused just outside the partially open door. I know you're in there. The voice was female, older, with a slight rasp that suggested years of whispering. You shouldn't have come here. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the notebook to her chest, uncertain whether to respond or stay silent. The unit was supposed to go to the family, the voice continued. But families aren't always what they seem, are they? Who are you? Sarah finally managed, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. A figure stepped into the doorway, a woman in her 60s, thin and weathered, wearing clothes that had seen better decades. But the eyes were unmistakable. They were Sarah's eyes, looking back at her from a face marked by time and hardship. "I'm the reason your father never talks about his past," the woman said. "I'm Elena Martinez, and I've been dead for 35 years. Sarah stared at the woman who shared her face, her name, her father's silence. "That's impossible. You can't be dead." Elena stepped further into the tiny house, moving with the familiarity of someone who knew every inch of the space. Officially, yes. Elena Martinez was murdered in 1988. The case was never solved because there was no body to find. Hard to find a body when the person isn't actually dead. But why? Why fake your own death? Why live like this? Elena's expression darkened. Because some truths are dangerous. Because sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to disappear completely. She gestured around the tiny house. This place, this life, it was supposed to be temporary, just until things cooled down. But 35 years later, here we are. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about her family cracking open. What kind of truth? What were you running from? Elena sat down heavily on the small built-in bench, suddenly looking every one of her years. Your father and I, we witnessed something we shouldn't have, something that involved very powerful, very dangerous people. They came after us both, but I was the easier target, so I gave them what they wanted, a dead end. And Dad? Roberto played the grieving brother perfectly, kept his head down, started over, built a quiet life, had a family. Elena's voice softened. Had you? The wind rattled the storage unit door again, and both women looked toward the sound. Elena's expression sharpened with alarm. We need to leave. Now. What? Why? Because someone's been watching this unit since the auction. And if they've connected you to me... Elena was already moving, grabbing a small bag from beneath the tiny sink. Then, 35 years of hiding just became worthless. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The image showed a man in his 50s with graying temples and kind eyes, the same eyes that had looked back at her from mirrors for 28 years. Beneath the photo, in careful handwriting, someone had written David Martinez, Uncle Dave. Uncle Dave. The name hit her like a physical blow. Her father had mentioned him only once, during a late-night conversation when Sarah was 16. A brother who'd disappeared years before she was born. Someone who'd gotten mixed up with the wrong people and vanished without a trace. Her father's voice had carried a weight of grief and regret that night. And when Sarah had asked more questions, he'd simply shaken his head and said some stories were better left buried. She set the photo aside with shaking fingers and reached for the stack of letters beneath it. The envelopes were yellowed with age, addressed to my dear brother in the same careful handwriting. Sarah opened the top letter, dated just 3 months ago. Miguel, I know you probably think I'm dead. Maybe it's better that way. But I need you to know that everything I did was to protect our family. The Kozlovs haven't forgotten, and they won't stop looking. I've been running for 15 years now, staying invisible, staying safe. But I'm tired, brother. So damn tired. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The Kozlovs, she'd heard whispers of that name in the news over the years. A crime family with ties to everything from money laundering to murder. What could her uncle have possibly done to earn their attention? She continued reading, her heart pounding with each revelation. The storage unit is perfect. Nobody thinks to look for someone living in a place they have to pay rent on every month. I've been here for 2 years now, and the old manager never asked questions. Cash up front, no paperwork. But there's a new owner now, and I heard they're planning to auction off the delinquent units. I tried to get current on the payments, but my contact got spooked. Says the Kozlovs have people watching the banks again. The letter continued, detailing a life lived in the shadows, of constantly looking over his shoulder, of missing his family but knowing that any contact would put them in danger. Sarah's eyes burned as she read about Christmases spent alone, birthdays forgotten, a life reduced to hiding in a glorified closet to keep the people he loved safe. A sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. Sarah quickly folded the letter and stuffed it into her jacket pocket, then moved to the small window. Through the thin curtain, she could see two figures approaching the storage facility's entrance. Even in the dim light, their purposeful stride and expensive suits screamed trouble. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears as she watched them stop at the facility's office. One of them, a tall man with platinum blonde hair, gestured toward the storage units while speaking into a cell phone. The other, shorter but broader, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, scanning the rows of metal doors with predatory patience. They were looking for something or someone. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah gathered the letters and photographs, shoving them into her jacket alongside the first letter. Her uncle's journal lay open on the bed, and she quickly flipped through the pages, her eyes catching fragments of entries that made her blood run cold. February 12th. Saw a black sedan parked outside Miguel's work today. Didn't recognize the plates. Stayed away from the neighborhood for a week. March 3rd. They're getting closer. Found my old apartment in Phoenix. Time to move again. At April 15th, new identity papers came through. David Martinez is officially dead. Again. The footsteps outside were getting closer, accompanied by the metallic sound of storage unit doors being rattled and tested. Sarah's mind raced. If these were the people her uncle had been hiding from, and if they somehow knew about this unit, then she was walking into the middle of something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. She pocketed the journal and moved toward the tiny house's door, then stopped. On the small table beside the bed, partially hidden beneath a coffee-stained newspaper, was a cell phone. It was old, probably a burner, but the screen lit up when she touched it. No missed calls, but there was a text message from yesterday, package delivered. Exit strategy alpha confirmed. Will contact you when safe. Exit strategy alpha. Her uncle wasn't just hiding, he was planning something. The footsteps stopped directly outside the storage unit. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the wall beside the window. Through the gap in the curtain, she could see a shadow moving past the door. Then came the sound she'd been dreading, someone testing the lock on Unit 247. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think like her father, who'd always been quick under pressure. She needed to get out of here, but more than that, she needed to understand what her uncle had gotten himself into, because one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. David Martinez wasn't just hiding from the past. He was actively fighting it. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph, studying the woman's face in the dim light filtering through the tiny house windows. The resemblance was undeniable, the same dark eyes, the delicate bone structure, even the way her hair fell across her shoulders. But this woman looked maybe 25, and the photo's edges were yellowed with age. "This can't be right," she whispered, setting the frame down with shaking fingers. She pulled out her phone and called her mother, pacing the narrow space between the kitchenette and the fold-out bed. The call went straight to voicemail. It always did these days. "Mom, it's me. I need to ask you something important. Can you call me back, please?" Sarah hung up and immediately dialed her Aunt Rosa, her mother's older sister who had always been the family historian. "Mija, what's wrong? You sound upset." "Tia Rosa, I need to ask you about Mom's family. Did she have any sisters? Anyone who might have looked like her?" A long pause stretched across the line. "Why are you asking about this now, Sarah? Please, just tell me. It's important." Rosa's sigh was heavy. "Your mother, she had a twin sister, Elena. They were separated when they were very young, during the troubles in El Salvador. Your grandmother brought your mother here, but Elena..." Her voice trailed off. "What happened to Elena?" "We never knew. Your mother spent years looking for her after we came to America. She hired investigators, sent letters to refugee organizations. Nothing. It broke her heart, Mija. That's why she doesn't like to talk about the past." Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto the tiny bed. Around her, the evidence was overwhelming. The Spanish books, the careful preservation of everything, the way this felt less like a hideout and more like a shrine to memory. Tia, what was Elena's full name? Elena Concepcion Restrepo. That was their maiden name, before your mother married your father. Sarah's breath caught. She'd seen that name, E. Restrepo, written inside one of the books on the shelf. Her mind raced, connecting dots that painted an impossible picture. Sarah, are you there? I'm here. Tia, if Elena was still alive, she'd be the same age as Mom, right? 58? Of course, but Mija, why are you... I have to go. Thank you. I'll call you later. Sarah ended the call and stood slowly, looking around the tiny house with new eyes. This wasn't just someone's hiding place. This was a shrine built by someone who had been searching, just like her mother had been searching. She moved to the kitchenette and began opening drawers more systematically. In the third one, underneath carefully folded dish towels, she found a manila folder thick with documents. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photocopied newspaper clippings, all in Spanish, dating back decades. Stories about refugee families, missing persons, immigration. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made her blood run cold. The writing was meticulous, desperate. Notes about following up on leads, phone numbers to call, addresses to check. And at the bottom of the folder, a list of names and addresses in the same careful handwriting. The third name down made her stomach drop, Carmen Restrepo Martinez, followed by her mother's current address. Oh my God, Sarah breathed. Underneath the papers was something that made everything else fade away, a small leather journal with Elena embossed on the cover. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. The entries were in Spanish, written in the same careful script as the margin notes. Even with her limited Spanish, she could make out enough to understand. Elena had found them. She'd been watching from a distance, learning about her sister's life, seeing that Carmen had built a family, a successful business, a good life. But she'd been afraid to make contact, afraid that showing up would disrupt everything Carmen had built, afraid that her sister had moved on and wouldn't want reminders of their painful past. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. She looks happy in her garden. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe some things should stay buried. Sarah closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. Somewhere out there was a woman who had been living in this tiny house, surviving on the edges, watching her sister's family from afar because she was too afraid of rejection to reach out. A woman who might have been watching Sarah herself, seeing her win the storage auction, maybe even following her here. The thought sent a chill down her spine. If Elena had been living here until recently, where was she now? And more importantly, was she still watching? Sarah gathered the photograph, the journal, and the folder of documents. She had to find Elena before Elena disappeared completely. Her mother deserved to know. They both deserved the truth. But as she prepared to leave, she heard footsteps outside the storage unit. The manila envelope trembled in Sarah's hands as she sat in her car outside the storage facility. Detective Chen had called twice in the past hour, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. The contents of the envelope felt like a loaded weapon, dangerous knowledge that would irrevocably change everything once unleashed. Inside the tiny house, Marcus paced the narrow aisle between the kitchenette and the bed, his movements sharp and agitated. Through the small window, he watched Sarah's car in the parking lot, noting how she kept looking at something in her lap. His jaw clenched. She'd found something. He could tell by the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the storage unit, as if it might explode. Sarah finally opened the envelope with shaking fingers. The first document was a birth certificate for Emma Louise Martinez, dated 15 years ago. Her breath caught. Martinez. The same last name, but this wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate. The mother's name was listed as Catherine Martinez, and the father's line remained blank. Her hands moved to the second document, a custody order granting temporary guardianship to one Marcus Rivera. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus, the same name as the man living in her storage unit, but the photograph attached to the legal papers showed someone much younger, barely out of his teens himself. The third document was a missing persons report filed 6 months ago. Emma Martinez, age 15, last seen leaving Lincoln High School. The girl in the school photo had Sarah's dark hair and olive complexion, but her eyes held a wariness that made Sarah's heart ache. This child looked like family, because she was. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk, parking lot, 5 minutes. Come alone." Through her rearview mirror, she saw Marcus emerging from the storage facility, his posture tense but purposeful. He'd changed from the nervous, almost childlike person she'd encountered before. This version of Marcus moved with the calculated precision of someone who'd been planning for this moment. She stepped out of her car, clutching the envelope against her chest like armor. "You're Marcus Rivera, and Emma is your niece." He stopped 10 feet away, hands visible but ready. "Your sister Catherine never told you about her daughter, did she?" The words hit like physical blows. Catherine, her estranged sister, who died 2 years ago from an overdose. They'd barely spoken in the last decade, their relationship fractured by Catherine's addiction and Sarah's inability to watch her self-destruct. Catherine had a daughter? Emma's been in the system since Catherine died, bounced between foster homes, group facilities. She aged out of the good placements and ended up in situations that... Marcus's voice cracked. "She was being hurt, Sarah, really hurt. I couldn't let that continue. So you kidnapped her." "I protected her." His eyes flashed with fierce conviction. "I was her caseworker. I saw what those places were doing to her. The system failed her completely, just like it failed Catherine." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "The tiny house. You've been hiding her here?" "It was temporary. I've been trying to find her family, someone who could take legal custody. That's when I discovered you, Catherine's sister. But then you won the auction, and everything fell apart. Where is she now?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus studied her face intently, as if trying to read her soul. "She's safe, but she's scared. The police have been looking for her, and she thinks they'll just put her back in the system. She doesn't know about you yet." Detective Chen said there was evidence of violence in the unit. "Emma had injuries when I got her out of the last foster home. Broken ribs, bruises. I documented everything, treated her injuries myself. I'm a trained EMT." His voice grew harder. "The system did that to her, not me." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If what Marcus was saying was true, then Emma was her only remaining family, Catherine's daughter, hidden away in the system while Sarah lived her life completely unaware. But if he was lying, if this was an elaborate manipulation, I want to see her. "Sarah, if you call the police, they'll arrest me and put Emma right back where she came from. She'll disappear into the system again, and this time they'll make sure she's placed somewhere I can't find her. And if I don't call them, I'm harboring a fugitive and an abducted minor. She's your niece. Family." Marcus stepped closer, his intensity almost overwhelming. "Catherine named you as the preferred guardian in her will. I have the documents. You have legal grounds to petition for custody." The weight of decision pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching, though they might be heading anywhere in the city. But somehow, she knew her time was running out. "Where is Emma?" Marcus smiled for the first time since she'd met him. "Follow me." The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the familiar face smiling back at her from 20 years ago. Her sister Elena, arm in arm with a man Sarah had never seen before, standing in front of what looked like the very tiny house, now hidden in the storage unit. But that was impossible. Elena had been dead for 2 decades. "This can't be right," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, she noticed other details that made her stomach lurch. Elena's engagement ring, the one their mother had given her, glinted on her finger in the photo, the same ring that had supposedly been buried with her. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Found something. Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th Street. Come alone." She glanced around the storage unit one more time, her eyes lingering on the tiny house that had already revealed so many secrets. The children's toys, the recent food, the photographs, all of it pointed to something her rational mind refused to accept. With the photo clutched against her chest, she locked up and drove to meet Marcus. The coffee shop was nearly empty at this hour. Marcus sat in a corner booth, his laptop open and several manila folders spread across the table. His expression was grim as she approached. "You're not going to like what I've found," he said without preamble. Sarah slid into the booth across from him, placing the photograph face down on the table. "I'm not sure anything could surprise me at this point. Elena's death certificate was filed in 2003, just like you said. Car accident, body recovered from the river." Marcus paused, studying her face. "But here's the thing. I also found a marriage certificate filed 6 months earlier. Elena Martinez to James Kovac." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Kovac? As in the storage unit owner? Gets better. Or worse, depending on how you look at it. Marcus turned his laptop screen toward her. "James Kovac died in 2019. Natural causes according to the death certificate. But look at this." He clicked to another document. "Property records show that James Kovac purchased that storage facility in 2004, the year after Elena supposedly died. He owned it until his death, at which point ownership transferred to a trust." Sarah felt the world tilting around her. What kind of trust? That's where it gets interesting. The trust is managed by a law firm, but the beneficiary is listed as a Kovac. No first name given. With shaking hands, Sarah flipped over the photograph and slid it across the table. Marcus's eyes widened as he took in the image. "Sarah, if Elena married James Kovac and then supposedly died in that accident—" "She didn't die." The words came out as barely a whisper. "She's been hiding. All this time she's been hiding." Marcus leaned forward. "But why? Why would she fake her own death?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost declined the call, but something made her hesitate. With a glance at Marcus, she answered. "Hello?" Silence stretched across the line, broken only by the sound of someone breathing. Then, a voice she hadn't heard in 20 years but would recognize anywhere spoke her name. "Sarah." The phone nearly slipped from her grasp. "Elena? I know you found the unit. I've been watching the security cameras." Elena's voice was different now, older, wearier, but unmistakably hers. "We need to talk." "You're supposed to be dead." Sarah's voice cracked with 2 decades of grief and anger. "Do you have any idea what your death did to our family? To me? I know. God, Sarah, I know. But I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. Not when your husband works for people who kill witnesses." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt Marcus's hand on her arm, steadying her. "What are you talking about?" Sarah managed. "James wasn't who I thought he was when I married him. By the time I found out, I knew too much. The accident, it wasn't an accident. It was supposed to be my death, but James helped me escape. We've been hiding ever since. And the children in the storage unit?" A long pause. "My daughters, your nieces. James died 5 years ago, and I've been raising them alone, moving between safe houses. The storage unit was supposed to be temporary until I could figure out our next move." Sarah's mind reeled. "Elena, this is insane. Come home. We'll figure this out together." "You don't understand. They're still out there. The people James worked for. They think I'm dead, and it needs to stay that way. But now that you've found us—" Elena's voice trailed off. "Now what?" "Now, you're in danger too." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone while everything she thought she knew about her life crumbled around her. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she studied the faces staring back at her. 3 children, maybe 8 to 12 years old, standing in front of what looked like a carnival. Their clothes were dated, probably early 2000s, but what made her stomach clench was the familiar backdrop behind them. The same tiny house she was standing in now, but positioned differently, as if it had been moved. Detective Morrison leaned closer, his breath warm against her shoulder. "Do you recognize any of them?" Sarah shook her head, but something nagged at her. The oldest child, a girl with dark braided hair, had eyes that seemed familiar. Not the face, but the expression. Wary, protective, like someone who'd learned too young to watch for danger. "There are more photos underneath," Jake whispered from where he crouched by the loose floorboard. He'd managed to pry it up completely, revealing a metal box that had been carefully wrapped in plastic. Inside were dozens of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a journal bound in cracked leather. Morrison took charge, spreading the contents across the tiny dining table with practiced efficiency. Sarah found herself drawn to the journal, its pages yellowed and filled with careful handwriting that changed over time, starting with childish block letters and evolving into more sophisticated script. "It's a record," she said, reading aloud. "Day 847, moved the house again. Found a new lot behind the old Miller farm. Think we're safe here for a while. Day 863, someone came asking questions at the school. Had to take Emma and run." "Emma," Morrison repeated, making a note. "That could be our dark-haired girl." Sarah continued reading, her voice growing quieter with each entry. The journal painted a picture of children living in constant motion, always one step ahead of something or someone. The tiny house wasn't just a home, it was a mobile safe house, designed to be moved whenever danger got too close. "Look at this," Jake said, holding up a newspaper clipping. The headline made Sarah's blood run cold. 3 children missing after foster care scandal breaks. The accompanying photos matched the children from the first photograph exactly. "This is from 2003, Morrison said, studying the date. 20 years ago. He looked up at Sarah. "Which means, if these kids survived, they're adults now." Sarah felt the pieces clicking together in her mind, but the picture they formed didn't make sense. So someone was hiding these missing children in the tiny house, moving them around to keep them safe, or keep them hidden, Morrison countered grimly. "We don't know if this was a rescue operation or something darker." Jake had moved to the kitchenette and was systematically opening cabinets. "There's food here. Canned goods mostly, but some of the dates are recent, within the last 6 months. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone's still using this place. Morrison was already on his radio, calling for backup and a crime scene team, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at the journal, at an entry near the end of the filled pages. Day 1203. Emma's 18 now. Says she wants to go to college, have a normal life. But normal isn't safe for people like us. The man who hurt us is still out there, still looking, still has friends in high places. The house is our protection. It always has been." "Sarah." Jake's voice was sharp with urgency. She looked up to find him standing by the back window, his face pale. "There's someone outside." Morrison drew his weapon, motioning for them to get down. Through the gap in the curtains, Sarah could see a figure moving through the trees at the edge of the storage facility, tall, wearing dark clothes, and moving with purpose toward their unit. "Is there another way out?" Morrison whispered. Sarah shook her head. The tiny house only had one door, and it faced the same direction as the approaching figure. They were trapped. The footsteps outside grew closer, crunching on the gravel. Morrison positioned himself by the door, weapon ready, while Jake pulled Sarah toward the back of the house. The journal was still in her hands, and she clutched it like a lifeline. A soft knock echoed through the tiny space. 3 short taps, then 2 long ones, then 3 short again. Sarah's breath caught. She'd heard that pattern before, in her grandmother's stories about the Underground Railroad, about secret signals used to identify safe passage. "Emma?" A voice called softly through the door. "Emma, it's okay. I know you're in there. I've been looking for you for so long." Morrison's grip on his weapon tightened, but something in the voice, young, female, desperate, made Sarah step forward. "Wait," she whispered. "What if this isn't the danger? What if this is someone looking for help?" The knocking came again, more insistent now, and Sarah realized they were about to discover whether the tiny house had been a sanctuary or a prison. The GPS led Sarah down a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the Colorado wilderness. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each mile marker that passed, Jake's warning echoing in her mind. The coordinates from the notebook had brought them here, to a place that felt deliberately forgotten. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked from the passenger seat, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "We could still turn back." Sarah glanced at him, noting the worry etched across his features. "We've come this far. Besides, Elena deserves to know what happened to her sister." The road curved sharply ahead, and suddenly the trees opened into a small clearing. What they saw made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. 3 tiny houses sat in a neat row, identical to the one she'd found in the storage unit, but these weren't abandoned. Solar panels glinted on their roofs, and she could see tire tracks in the dirt. "Jesus," Marcus whispered. "How many people are we talking about here?" Before Sarah could answer, a figure emerged from the middle house. A woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing practical clothes and work boots. She moved with purpose, heading directly toward their car with the confidence of someone who'd been expecting them. Sarah rolled down her window as the woman approached. Up close, she could see the resemblance. The same strong jawline as Elena, the same intelligent eyes, though these were harder, weathered by years of looking over her shoulder. "Carmen Rodriguez?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The woman nodded slowly. "You're the one who found Maria's house." It wasn't a question. "Sarah Martinez, this is Marcus Chen. Your sister has been looking for you for 8 years. Carmen's expression flickered, a moment of vulnerability before the mask slipped back into place. "Elena should have left it alone. You all should have." She gestured toward the tiny houses. "This isn't a game. People are dead because of what we know." "What do you know?" Marcus asked, leaning forward. Carmen studied them both for a long moment, as if weighing their trustworthiness against the risk of speaking. "Get out of the car. But know that once you hear this, you're in it, whether you want to be or not." They followed her to the middle house, and Sarah was struck by how similar it was to the one she'd discovered. The same efficient layout, the same hidden compartments. But this one felt lived in, with personal touches that spoke of years of careful, quiet existence. "Coffee?" Carmen asked, moving to a small electric kettle. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for cups. "Carmen," Sarah said gently, "your sister thinks you're dead. She's been mourning you for years." "Better that than actually dead," Carmen replied sharply. "Which is what would happen if certain people knew I was still alive." She poured 3 cups of coffee with practiced movements. Maria found out the hard way. Found out what? Carmen sat across from them, wrapping her hands around her mug as if drawing strength from its warmth. "We were nurses at Denver General, good ones. We cared about our patients, maybe too much." She took a sip of coffee, started noticing patterns in the pharmaceutical distribution, medications going missing, but not the usual stuff, not the painkillers or anything with street value. Cancer drugs, expensive ones. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Someone was stealing cancer medication? Not just stealing, replacing it with saline or cheaper alternatives. Patients were getting fake treatments while someone sold the real drugs on the black market. Carmen's voice turned bitter. "Do you know what happens to a cancer patient when their chemotherapy is actually just salt water?" Marcus set down his cup. "They die. We documented everything. Names, dates, lot numbers. Built a case that would have brought down half the hospital administration and God knows how many other people in the supply chain." Carmen stood, moving to a window that overlooked the other houses. Maria was supposed to take it to the FBI. Instead, she ended up dead in what looked like a car accident. Sarah thought about the meticulous records in the storage unit, the photographs, the fear that had driven Maria to hide her house away from the world. But she kept copies of everything. Smart girl. Paranoid but smart. Carmen turned back to them. "I went underground after her funeral, found others who'd stumbled onto pieces of the same network. We've been living off the grid ever since, trying to stay alive long enough to figure out how to expose this without getting ourselves killed. Others? Sarah asked, gesturing toward the remaining houses. A pharmacist who asked too many questions. A hospital administrator who wouldn't look the other way. People with conscience who became inconvenient. Carmen's expression hardened. The network is bigger than we originally thought. Multiple hospitals, multiple states, and they're very good at making problems disappear. The weight of what they'd stumbled into settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about finding Elena's missing sister anymore. This was about corruption that killed people, about a conspiracy that had already claimed Maria's life and forced Carmen into hiding. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Carmen smiled grimly. "Now you decide if you're brave enough to help us finish what Maria started." The sound of footsteps in the gravel outside made Sarah's blood freeze. She pressed herself against the tiny house's wall, barely breathing, as Detective Morrison's voice carried through the night air. "Storage Unit 47 should be just ahead," he said to someone. According to the auction records, Sarah Martinez bought it 3 days ago. Sarah's mind raced. How had Morrison found her so quickly? She'd been careful, hadn't told anyone where she was going tonight. Unless her phone. She quickly powered it down, cursing herself for not thinking of it sooner. "The unit's open," came another voice she didn't recognize. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel. Sarah peered through the tiny house's small window, straining to see in the darkness. 2 figures stood at the entrance to her storage unit, flashlight beams sweeping across the ground. Morrison's partner, maybe? Or someone else entirely? "She's been here recently," Morrison said. "Sarah," he called out, "I know you're here. We need to talk." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Sarah weighed her options. She could stay hidden and hope they'd leave, but Morrison seemed determined. And if he'd tracked her here, he probably wasn't going away empty-handed. "About what?" she called back finally, stepping partially into view but keeping her distance. Morrison's flashlight found her immediately. About Marcus Chen, about what really happened to him. The second figure stepped forward, a woman Sarah had never seen before, tall with short grey hair. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Agent Catherine Voss with the FBI. We have reason to believe you're in danger." "FBI?" Sarah's stomach dropped. This was spiraling far beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd bought that storage unit. Danger from whom? "The same people who killed Marcus Chen," Voss said. "The same people who've been using this storage facility as a way station for something much bigger than you realize." Sarah glanced back at the tiny house, thinking of the photographs, the documents, Marcus's careful handwriting documenting months of surveillance. "You know about the trafficking operation?" "We know Marcus was investigating it," Morrison said, moving closer. "We know he got too close and they silenced him. What we don't know is how much evidence he gathered and whether you found it." The weight of the manila envelope in Sarah's jacket felt heavier. She'd spent the last hour reading through Marcus's notes, piecing together a network that stretched from the storage facility to the docks, involving people in positions of power she never would have suspected. Names that made her hands shake as she read them. "He documented everything," she said quietly. "Names, dates, shipping manifests. He knew they were moving people through here, using the storage units as temporary holding areas." Agent Voss and Morrison exchanged a look. "How long have you known?" Voss asked. "I only found the files tonight. But I should have realized sooner. The supplies, the living conditions in there, the fact that someone was maintaining the space." Sarah gestured toward the tiny house. "Marcus wasn't just investigating this. He was protecting people, wasn't he?" Morrison nodded grimly. "We think he was helping trafficking victims escape the network, giving them temporary shelter while he arranged safe passage elsewhere. It's why they killed him, not just to stop his investigation, but to shut down his rescue operation. And now they know you have his files," Voss added. "Which means—" The sound of car engines approaching cut her off. Multiple vehicles, moving fast. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as headlights swept across the storage facility's entrance. Get down, Morrison hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the tiny house. Voss, call for backup. But as they reached the tiny house's door, Sarah realized something was wrong. The interior light was on, a light she distinctly remembered turning off, and there was a figure sitting at the small table inside, a figure she recognized from the photographs in Marcus's files. The man looked up as they approached, his face gaunt and tired. "Miss Martinez," he said in accented English, "my name is Victor. Marcus. He told me if anything happened, I should wait here, that someone would come." Sarah stared at him, understanding flooding through her. "You're one of the people he was helping." Victor nodded. "There are others, 12 others, hidden in units throughout the city. Marcus, he was going to move us to safety, but then—" He gestured helplessly. The car engines grew louder, closer. Through the storage unit's open door, Sarah could see headlights approaching their row. "They've been looking for us since Marcus died," Victor continued urgently. "But I stayed, like he said. I kept the list safe." He held up a small notebook, all the locations, all the names of people still waiting. Morrison grabbed his radio. "We need immediate backup at Eastside Storage, multiple units, and we need protective custody transport for at least 13 individuals." The vehicles were almost upon them now. Sarah looked from Victor's frightened face to the notebook in his hands, evidence of a dozen people whose lives hung in the balance, and realized that buying that storage unit hadn't just changed her life. It had made her responsible for saving others. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph, studying every detail of her own face, staring back at her from 20 years ago. The woman beside her younger self was unmistakably familiar, though Sarah couldn't place where she'd seen her before. Detective Rodriguez leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear as he examined the image. "You really don't remember this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't I?" Sarah's voice cracked. "But it's like looking at someone else's life." Marcus paced the narrow confines of the tiny house, his footsteps creating an anxious rhythm on the wooden floor. "This doesn't make sense. If you knew whoever was living here, why would they be hiding from you? Why all the surveillance equipment?" Sarah set the photograph down and picked up another item from the shoebox, a hospital bracelet with her name on it, dated March 15th, 2004. The plastic was yellowed with age, but the printing remained clear. Her stomach lurched as she read the ward designation, Psychiatric Emergency Services. "I was never in a psychiatric ward," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in. There were gaps in her memory from that period, time she'd attributed to stress from her divorce and the custody battle over Emma. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and made a quick call, stepping toward the door for privacy. Sarah caught fragments of his conversation, words like medical records and sealed files that made her blood run cold. Marcus sat down beside her on the small built-in bench, his presence oddly comforting despite everything. "Hey, whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." Sarah appreciated his support, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He was starting to look at her differently, and she couldn't blame him. The evidence was mounting that she wasn't who she thought she was, or at least that there were parts of her past she'd either forgotten or deliberately buried. Rodriguez ended his call and turned back to them, his expression grim. "I've got someone pulling records from 2004. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." She nodded, bracing herself. "Have you ever heard the name Dr. Elizabeth Kane?" The name hit her like a physical blow. Images flashed through her mind, a sterile office, the smell of antiseptic, a woman with kind eyes but cold hands. Sarah gripped the edge of the bench as the room seemed to tilt around her. "She was my therapist," Sarah whispered, "after the divorce, but I only saw her a few times. According to the records I'm seeing here, you were her patient for 8 months. Intensive therapy sessions, sometimes 3 times a week." Sarah shook her head violently. "That's not possible. I would remember." "What if you weren't supposed to remember?" Marcus interrupted, his voice tight. What if that was the point? Rodriguez held up his phone, showing them a photograph of an older woman with silver hair and sharp features. Sarah's breath caught as recognition flooded through her. This was the woman in the photograph with her younger self. Dr. Elizabeth Kane lost her medical license in 2005 for conducting unauthorized experimental treatments on patients. The specifics were sealed, but there were allegations of memory manipulation and psychological conditioning. The tiny house suddenly felt even smaller, the walls pressing in around Sarah as the implications sank in. She stood abruptly, needing space to think, but there was nowhere to go. Every surface seemed to mock her with evidence of a life she couldn't remember living. "The surveillance equipment," she said suddenly. "It's not random. Someone's been watching me specifically, waiting for me to come here." Marcus stood and moved to the window, peering through the blinds. What if Dr. Kane is still alive? What if she's the one living here? "She'd be in her 70s now," Rodriguez said, checking his phone again. Officially, she disappeared in 2006, right after the investigation into her practice began. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as another memory surfaced, fragments of conversations about starting fresh and creating new pathways. She remembered feeling grateful at the time, believing the therapy was helping her cope with the trauma of her divorce. But what if it had been something else entirely? A soft sound from outside made them all freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. Rodriguez immediately drew his weapon, motioning for Sarah and Marcus to stay back. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft jingling of keys. "She's coming back," Sarah whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the small window they could see a figure approaching in the gathering dusk, an elderly woman with silver hair, moving with surprising agility despite her obvious age. Dr. Elizabeth Kane had finally decided to come home. The abandoned warehouse felt different in daylight, though Sarah couldn't pinpoint exactly how. Maybe it was the way dust motes danced in the filtered sunlight streaming through grimy windows, or perhaps it was simply that she was no longer running for her life. Detective Morrison had insisted on accompanying her back to retrieve any remaining evidence from the tiny house, and his presence provided a comfort she hadn't realized she desperately needed. "You're sure about this?" Morrison asked as they approached the storage unit. "We could get a full forensics team out here instead." Sarah shook her head, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the padlock. "Emma trusted me with this. If there's something else hidden in there, something that could help us understand what really happened to her, I need to find it myself." The metal door rolled up with its familiar screech, revealing the tiny house in all its peculiar perfection. In the daylight, Sarah could see details she'd missed during her first frantic exploration. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every joint seamless, every surface lovingly finished. This hadn't been thrown together by someone in hiding. This had been built by someone who understood that they might be living here for a very long time. Morrison let out a low whistle. "I've seen plenty of strange things in my 20 years on the force, but this takes the cake. You said you found journals?" "In the bedroom. But I have a feeling there's more." Sarah stepped carefully through the diminutive living room, her eyes scanning for anything that seemed out of place. Emma was methodical about everything else. She wouldn't have left just one record of what she'd discovered. They spent the next hour methodically searching every inch of the space. Morrison examined the kitchen area while Sarah focused on the bedroom, looking for hidden compartments or loose floorboards. It was Morrison who made the discovery. "Sarah, you need to see this." His voice carried an odd note of excitement mixed with concern. She found him crouched beside what appeared to be a decorative panel near the tiny house's front door. Upon closer inspection, she realized it wasn't decorative at all. It was a carefully concealed access panel. "How did you find it?" Old habit. In domestic situations, people hide things near exits, makes them feel like they can grab what's important and run. Morrison's fingers worked at the panel's edges until it popped free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a manila envelope, sealed and marked with Emma's distinctive handwriting, "For whoever finds this, the truth about Meridian Industries." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be financial records. But it was the letter on top, written in Emma's careful script, that made her blood run cold. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and my suspicions about Meridian Industries have been confirmed. The company isn't just involved in illegal weapons trafficking. They're using a network of shell corporations to funnel money to domestic terrorist organizations. I have evidence that the warehouse explosion 3 years ago wasn't an accident. It was a test run." Morrison read over her shoulder, his breathing growing heavier with each word. Jesus Christ! A test run for what? Sarah continued reading aloud. "The man who's been hunting me calls himself Vincent, but his real name is Marcus Webb. He's not just a Meridian employee, he's former military, dishonorably discharged for conducting unauthorized experiments on civilian populations overseas. Meridian hired him to handle security issues that required permanent solutions." The photographs showed Webb in military uniform, then in civilian clothes meeting with men Sarah didn't recognize. But the financial documents were what made the scope of the conspiracy clear. Millions of dollars flowing through dummy accounts, payments to known extremist groups, and shipping manifests for equipment that had no legitimate civilian purpose. Emma was building a case, Sarah whispered. She wasn't just hiding from them, she was gathering evidence to bring them down. Morrison was already on his phone, calling for backup and federal involvement. But Sarah's attention was caught by the final page of Emma's letter. "The most important evidence isn't in this hiding place. It's in the place where this all started, my old apartment. I left something there that will prove everything, hidden where only someone who truly knew me would think to look. If I don't survive this, I pray that whoever finds this has the courage to finish what I started." Sarah felt her heart sink. Her apartment was destroyed in a fire 6 months ago. Whatever she hid there is gone. But even as she said the words, something nagged at her. Emma had been too careful, too methodical to rely on a single hiding place. And the way she'd phrased the letter suggested she'd anticipated the possibility that her apartment might be compromised. Morrison finished his call and turned back to her. "Federal agents are on their way. This is bigger than we thought, Sarah. With this evidence, we can bring down the entire network." Sarah nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, working through Emma's words like a puzzle. The place where it all started. Someone who truly knew me. The answers were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone clever enough to see them. The warehouse felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, its familiar spaces transformed into something alien and threatening. Sarah crouched behind a stack of cardboard boxes, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the main entrance through the grimy window. Detective Chen had positioned himself near the loading dock, barely visible in the shadows cast by an old forklift. They'd been waiting for 2 hours, and doubt was starting to creep in like the cold seeping through the concrete floor. What if Marcus didn't show? What if he'd somehow discovered their plan? Sarah's fingers found the small recording device in her pocket, checking for the 100th time that it was still there. A soft scraping sound made her freeze, not from the entrance they'd been watching, but from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized Marcus had found another way in. She pressed herself lower against the boxes, trying to control her breathing. Footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, deliberate and confident. He wasn't trying to hide his presence anymore. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice carried across the warehouse, almost conversational. "I know you're here. Your car's in the parking lot." She closed her eyes, cursing herself for not thinking about the car. Of course he would have noticed it. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Marcus continued, his footsteps growing closer. "You've seen what I'm capable of protecting, what I've built here. But you don't understand the bigger picture." Despite every instinct screaming at her to remain hidden, Sarah found herself listening. There was something in his tone that wasn't quite what she'd expected from a man who had killed to protect his secrets. "Do you know what it's like?" Marcus said, his voice now coming from somewhere near the tiny house. To watch everything you've worked for crumble because of one person's greed, one person's inability to see past their own immediate needs. Sarah risked a glance around the edge of the boxes. Marcus stood beside the tiny house, but he wasn't looking for her. He was staring at the structure he'd built, and in the dim emergency lighting, his expression looked almost heartbroken. David was supposed to understand, Marcus continued. He was supposed to see that what we were building here was bigger than any individual project. The research, the technology we were developing, it could have changed everything. The recording device felt heavy in Sarah's pocket. This wasn't the confession they'd hoped for, but it was something. She carefully shifted position, trying to get a clearer view while keeping the boxes between them. But he got scared when the funding got complicated, when we had to make some creative arrangements to keep the project alive. He threatened to expose everything, to destroy years of work, because he couldn't handle a little moral ambiguity. Marcus's hand traced along the tiny house's exterior wall, almost lovingly. Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a hiding place or a storage solution. This was a monument, a shrine to whatever twisted justification Marcus had constructed for his actions. "I tried to reason with him," Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Right here, actually. I brought him here to show him what we'd accomplished, to make him understand why we couldn't just walk away." Sarah's hand moved slowly toward the recording device. She needed to get this, needed to capture whatever he was about to say. He still wouldn't listen. Even when I explained about the investors we couldn't cross, about what would happen if we failed them, he was going to destroy everything over some misguided sense of ethics. The warehouse's heating system kicked on with a mechanical groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Sarah held her breath, certain that Marcus would hear her elevated heartbeat over the ambient noise. "I never meant for it to happen," Marcus said, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly. "It was supposed to be a conversation, a negotiation. But David, he tried to leave, actually turned his back on me and started walking toward his car." Sarah's fingers finally found the record button on the device, pressing it as carefully as she could manage. I grabbed his arm, just to stop him from leaving, to make him listen. But he pulled away and Marcus paused, running both hands through his hair. The equipment was right there, the metal framework we'd been using for the structural tests. He hit it when he fell, and the silence stretched out, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and Sarah's carefully controlled breathing. I panicked. Marcus finally continued. I should have called for help, should have tried to explain, but all I could think about was the project, the money, the people who were counting on us. So I cleaned it up, made it disappear. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her mind racing. This wasn't the cold-blooded murder they'd assumed. It was something messier, more human, and somehow more terrifying because of it. The abandoned warehouse felt like a tomb as Sarah crept through the shadows, Marcus close behind her. Their footsteps echoed despite their attempts at stealth, the sound bouncing off rusted metal beams and broken concrete. The address from Elena's notebook had led them here, to the industrial district where half the buildings stood empty like broken teeth. "Are you sure this is right?" Marcus whispered, his voice tight with tension. Sarah checked her phone again, the screen's glow illuminating the faded numbers on the warehouse wall. Building 847. This is it. She pocketed the device and pulled out the small flashlight they'd brought, keeping the beam low and narrow. They'd spent the last hour planning their approach after Elena's revelation about the witness protection program. The tiny house hadn't been a refuge for a runaway, it had been a safe house, and according to Elena's terrified confession, there were others, multiple locations scattered throughout the city, all part of a network that had gone dark 6 months ago. The warehouse's main entrance hung open, the chain that had once secured it lying severed on the ground. "Recent cuts," Sarah noted. "Someone had been here recently." "I don't like this," Marcus muttered. But he followed her inside anyway. The interior stretched vast and empty, broken only by support columns and the skeletal remains of old machinery. But Sarah's flashlight caught something else. a structure in the far corner, partially hidden behind a makeshift wall of shipping containers. Another tiny house. This one was different from the first, more hastily constructed and showing signs of recent habitation. A generator hummed softly nearby, and Sarah could smell the faint aroma of canned food and unwashed clothing. "Hello?" she called out softly. "We're not here to hurt anyone." A crash from behind the containers made them both freeze, then silence, heavy and oppressive. "Please," Sarah continued, stepping closer, "we know about the program, about what happened to the safe houses. We just want to help." A face appeared in one of the tiny house's windows, pale, frightened, young. A girl, maybe 16, with dark hair and wide eyes that spoke of too much fear for someone her age. "You're not supposed to be here," the girl said through the glass, her voice muffled but audible. "Neither are you, I'm guessing," Sarah replied gently. "What's your name?" The girl's eyes darted between Sarah and Marcus, calculating. "Lily. And if you know about the program, then you know why I can't trust you." Marcus stepped forward. "We found another house, in a storage unit. There was evidence someone had been living there, hiding there." "That was mine," Lily said, her voice breaking slightly. "Before everything went wrong." Sarah felt the pieces clicking together. "You're the witness, the one they were protecting." Lily's laugh was bitter, far too old for her years. "Was protecting, until someone sold me out, until they killed my handler and burned down the first safe house with me barely getting out alive." The weight of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. This girl had been living in the storage unit, then fled here when even that became unsafe. "Who's after you, Lily?" "People with a lot of money and no conscience." Lily pressed her face closer to the window. "I saw something I shouldn't have, a murder. Someone important, someone connected, and now they want to make sure I never testify." Marcus's phone buzzed suddenly, the sound sharp in the quiet space. He glanced at it and went rigid. "Sarah, we need to go. Now. What is it?" "Elena. She's not answering her phone. And there's a news alert. There was an explosion at her apartment building 20 minutes ago." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Elena had been their only contact with the official investigation, their only ally with access to the federal databases. If she was gone— "They found her," Lily said, and her voice was hollow with resignation. "Just like they found Agent Morrison, just like they'll find me." "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "We're not leaving you here. Get your things. You're coming with us." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Sarah cut her off. "You're 16 years old and you're alone and scared. But you're not alone anymore." Lily stared at her for a long moment, then disappeared from the window. Sounds of hurried packing came from inside the tiny house. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "What are you doing? We can't protect her. We don't even know who we're up against." "Then we figure it out. Together." Sarah met his eyes. "This girl is the key to everything, Marcus. The storage unit, the tiny house, all of it. It was never about finding hidden treasure. It was about finding her." The warehouse's main door clanged somewhere behind them, the sound echoing through the space, then voices, multiple people trying to move quietly and failing. "Back exit," Lily whispered, emerging from the tiny house with a hastily packed backpack. "There's a way out through the old loading dock." Sarah's heart hammered as they moved deeper into the shadows, 3 fugitives now instead of 2 investigators. But as they reached the rear of the warehouse, she realized their biggest challenge wasn't escaping. It was figuring out who they could trust in a world where even federal agents weren't safe. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocating in its perfection. Sarah pressed her back against the door she'd just locked, her heart hammering as Detective Morrison's footsteps echoed in the storage facility outside. Through the tiny window, she watched his flashlight beam sweep across the adjacent units, methodical and thorough. "He's persistent," Maya whispered from the kitchen nook, her voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The weight of everything, the forged documents, the hidden rooms, the carefully constructed new identity Maya had built, pressed down on her chest like a physical force. She'd made her choice when she'd warned Maya, but the reality of actively hiding from the police felt surreal. The flashlight beam passed by their window once, twice, then moved away. Sarah counted to 30 before carefully peering out. Morrison was 3 units down now, checking each lock with his penlight. "We need to get you out of here," Sarah said, turning back to Maya. "Tonight." Maya shook her head. "Where would I go? I've been planning this for months, Sarah. Every detail, every contingency except—" She gestured helplessly around the cabin. "Except someone like you, someone like me, someone who cares." Maya's voice cracked. "Do you know how long it's been since anyone gave a damn whether I lived or died?" Sarah moved closer, noting how Maya's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee mug. The confident woman who detailed Victor Chen's crimes was gone, replaced by someone who looked fragile and lost. "Tell me about the night you supposedly died," Sarah said softly. Maya closed her eyes. "I'd been gathering evidence for weeks. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographs of meetings that never officially happened. Victor was planning to eliminate 3 more people, competitors who'd figured out his money laundering operation. I couldn't let that happen." "So you went to the police?" A bitter laugh escaped Maya's lips. "I tried, but Victor had connections everywhere. The day after I contacted Detective Harrison, Morrison's predecessor, Victor's men came for me. I barely escaped." Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. "That's when you faked your death." "I had help. A friend who worked at the morgue, someone Victor hadn't bought yet. We staged the whole thing, my car going into the lake, a body that was never quite recovered. It gave me time to disappear completely." The flashlight beam was moving back their direction. Sarah quickly turned off the cabin's small lamp, plunging them into darkness, except for the pale glow from Maya's laptop screen. "But you didn't disappear," Sarah realized. "You've been here, still gathering evidence." 8 months. Every financial transaction, every illegal meeting, every dirty deal. I have enough to bring down Victor's entire operation, but I needed the right moment, the right ally. Morrison's footsteps had stopped. Sarah peered through the window and saw him standing directly in front of their storage unit, studying the lock with his flashlight. Sarah's pulse quickened. The lock looked normal from the outside, but anyone with experience would notice the modifications Maya had made to allow interior access. Morrison definitely had that experience. "Sarah," Maya breathed, noticing where she was looking. They both held perfectly still as Morrison examined the lock mechanism. His light played across the metal, and Sarah was certain he could hear her heartbeat from outside. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then his radio crackled. "Morrison, we've got movement at the north entrance. Possible break-in." Morrison's attention shifted immediately. "On my way," he responded, already moving toward the exit. They waited until his footsteps faded completely before either dared to breathe normally. "That was close," Sarah whispered. "Too close. He'll be back, probably with a warrant." Maya was already moving, pulling files from hidden compartments Sarah hadn't even noticed. "I have to move everything tonight." "Move it where?" Maya paused, looking uncertain for the first time since Sarah had discovered her. "I don't know. I never had a backup plan for this scenario." Sarah made her decision. "My house. Temporarily until we figure out next steps." "Sarah, no. You've already risked enough by warning me. If they trace this back to you—" "They won't," Sarah said, with more confidence than she felt. "Besides, you said you needed the right ally. Maybe that's why I won that auction. Maybe everything happens for a reason." Maya studied her face in the laptop's glow. "You realize what you're offering? If we do this, you become an accessory. There's no going back." Outside, the storage facility had gone quiet again, but they both knew Morrison would return, and next time he might not come alone. Sarah thought about her ordinary life, her predictable routines, the safety she'd built around herself since David's death. Then she looked at Maya, brilliant, desperate, fighting alone against forces that had already tried to kill her once. "I'm already in this," Sarah said. "The question is whether we're going to finish it." The abandoned warehouse felt like a tomb as Sarah crept through the shadows, Detective Kane's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of her. Each step echoed off the concrete walls, amplifying the sound until it seemed like an army was marching behind them. Her heart hammered against her ribs as they approached the source of the coordinates from Marcus's phone. "There," Kane whispered, pointing toward a cluster of storage containers stacked in the far corner. "Container 47B. Sarah's blood ran cold. The same numbering system as the storage facility where she'd found the tiny house. This wasn't coincidence. It was a network. Kane's radio crackled to life. "Backup is 2 minutes out," came the dispatcher's voice. "We can't wait," Sarah said, surprising herself with her determination. "If Marcus is in there." Kane nodded grimly and approached the container. Unlike the rusted exterior, the lock was new, high-tech. He pulled out a small device, some kind of police lockpick, and worked at it methodically. The mechanism clicked open with a soft snick that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. As Kane slowly pulled the door open, Sarah braced herself for anything, but what she saw made her gasp. The container had been converted into a mobile command center. Banks of monitors lined the walls, displaying feeds from dozens of cameras. Sarah recognized some of the locations: the storage facility, her apartment building, the coffee shop where she'd met with Kane. They'd been watched every step of the way. But it was the figure hunched over a keyboard in the center that made her heart stop. "Marcus?" she called out. The man turned, and Sarah's world tilted. It wasn't Marcus. It was someone she'd never seen before, thin, pale, with wild eyes that darted between her and Kane like a cornered animal. "Where's Marcus Chen?" Kane demanded, his weapon drawn but not aimed. The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Marcus? You still think this is about Marcus?" Sarah's mind raced. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been cleaning up your father's mess for 15 years, the man said, his voice bitter. "Did you really think David Martinez was the only one involved in the trafficking ring? He was small-time, a courier. The real operation." He gestured at the monitors. "This is what your father stumbled into, what got him killed." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. "My father was murdered?" "By his own partners when he grew a conscience. Started asking too many questions." "Sound familiar?" The man's eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. Like father, like daughter. Kane stepped closer, keeping his body between Sarah and the stranger. "Who are you working for?" "The same people who've been using that storage facility as a way station for 20 years. Your little tiny house discovery? That was a safe house for witnesses, people who needed to disappear before they could testify." The man's fingers flew over the keyboard and several monitors went dark. "Marcus Chen was supposed to retrieve some very important files before you got involved." Sarah's legs felt weak. The journal, the photos. That wasn't evidence against some random trafficking ring. It was evidence against sitting judges, police commissioners, city officials, people with enough power to make problems disappear. The man stood slowly, his hands visible. People who don't appreciate having their business scattered across the internet by amateur detectives. The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the warehouse. The man smiled coldly. "Your backup won't help you. Half the force is on the payroll." Kane's jaw tightened. "That's why you wanted to meet here. Away from the station. Smart cop. Too bad it won't matter." The man reached for something on his desk. "Don't move!" Kane shouted. But the man wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pressed a button, and all the monitors flashed once before going permanently black. "Evidence deleted," he said with satisfaction. "Every file, every photo, every connection your father tried to document, gone." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. The backup drives. In the tiny house? Already retrieved. "Did you really think we'd leave loose ends?" The man tilted his head. "Although I admit, your determination was unexpected. Most people would have taken the hint after the first break-in." The warehouse doors burst open as SWAT officers poured in, but Sarah barely noticed them. Her mind was reeling with the implications. Her father hadn't been a victim of random violence. He'd been silenced by a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement and government. And now, they knew she knew. As the officers moved to secure the scene, Sarah caught Kane's eye. In his expression, she saw the same realization that was dawning on her. This wasn't the end of their investigation. It was just the beginning. The real enemy was still out there, more powerful and more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The man was right about one thing: she was exactly like her father, and that might be the only thing that could bring his killers to justice. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph Detective Chen had just shown her. The image was grainy, taken from a security camera across the street from the storage facility, but there was no mistaking the figure emerging from Unit 47 in the early morning hours 3 days ago. It was her father. "This can't be right," she whispered, sinking into the plastic chair in the police station's interview room. "My father died in a car accident when I was 12. Chen leaned forward, his expression gentle but persistent. "Sarah, we ran the facial recognition software 3 times. We also found his fingerprints throughout the tiny house. Miguel Santos didn't die in that accident. He disappeared." The room seemed to tilt around her. Sarah gripped the table's edge, fighting waves of nausea as 23 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled. "But we had a funeral. There was a body, badly burned, identified through dental records that we now believe were falsified. Someone went to great lengths to make Miguel Santos disappear permanently." Chen slid another file across the table. "Until now." Sarah stared at the documents without really seeing them. Her mind raced back through the contents of the tiny house, seeing them now with devastating clarity. The medications weren't for some random fugitive. They were for her father's diabetes, the same condition that had required careful monitoring throughout her childhood. The books on home renovation weren't hiding places for contraband. They were the same worn copies he'd read to her on weekend mornings when they dreamed of fixing up their ramshackle house together. And the photo of her at age 12, the one that had started this whole investigation, wasn't some stalker's trophy. It was a father's keepsake, the last image of his daughter before he'd been forced to vanish from her life completely. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why would he leave me?" Chen's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it before standing. "We might have those answers soon. There's been a development." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the door opened, and Agent Rodriguez from the FBI stepped inside, followed by a man Sarah had never seen before. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested federal authority at the highest levels. "Ms. Martinez," Rodriguez said, "this is Deputy Director Walsh. He has some information about your father that might help explain everything." Walsh took the seat across from Sarah, his grey eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Your father was one of our most valuable assets," he said without preamble. "For 3 years, he infiltrated the Mendoza cartel's money laundering operation here in Phoenix. The intelligence he provided helped us dismantle their entire Western network." Sarah felt her world shifting again, like standing on sand during an earthquake. "My father was FBI?" "Not officially. He was what we call a cooperating witness, someone working off charges of his own while helping us build cases against bigger fish." Walsh paused, and something like regret flickered across his features. "The day of his supposed accident, we received credible intelligence that his cover had been blown. We had less than 6 hours to extract him before the cartel made their move. So you faked his death." The pieces were falling into place now, each one more painful than the last. "It was the only way to keep him alive," Rodriguez added. "And to protect you. The Mendoza organization had already demonstrated they weren't above targeting family members." Sarah thought of the newspaper clippings in the tiny house, all the stories about her life he'd been following from a distance. Her high school graduation, her college acceptance, her wedding announcement, her divorce. 23 years of a father watching his daughter grow up through stolen glimpses and Google searches. "Where is he now?" she asked. Walsh and Rodriguez exchanged glances. We were hoping you could help us with that, Walsh admitted. He's been off the grid for the past 4 days. His handler lost contact, and we have reason to believe he may be in immediate danger. The photograph Chen had shown her suddenly took on new meaning. Her father emerging from the storage unit 3 days ago, not hiding but running. Again. The cartel found him, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. That's why he abandoned the tiny house. That's why he was carrying the go-bag. We think so, Rodriguez confirmed. Recent arrests have shaken up the organization's leadership. Someone may have decided to settle old scores. Sarah stood abruptly, her mind racing. The medications. He left his diabetes medication behind. He'll need more within days, maybe hours. Chen looked up from his notes. Do you have any idea where he might go? Anywhere he might feel safe? Sarah closed her eyes, reaching back through decades of buried memories to the bedtime stories her father used to tell her about a secret cabin in the mountains where they'd go someday when the world got too heavy to bear. She opened her eyes, hope and terror warring in her chest. Maybe, but we need to hurry.